Hello, Cinefans. I'm Kendall Kruver, and this is Watching Classic Movies. My guest is Esther Bley, creator of the beautifully curated queer animation database and writer for Cartoon Research. We talked about queer images in animation from the pre-code era to the present day, how cartoon representation differs from live action, and about the animation they find most interesting from each era. Welcome, Esther. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
It's funny, we met because I made an error on one of my YouTube videos. I had a video about the sissy stereotype in classic Hollywood, and you asked me about a clip in there, and I had mixed up my Joan Crawford flicks, and I had the wrong one in there. And, usually I was just telling you, I'm usually so embarrassed when I make a mistake, but sometimes good things come of it. And getting to know you and this wonderful project you're working on has been a benefit of that. So it's queer animation, and it's a resource of queer animation through the years. So tell me about your project and how you started it.
I was checking my timeline earlier today. Sometimes I kind of forget when I started doing this work, but I would say I really started to do it maybe about 4 to 3.5 years ago. And basically, I have seen queer representation animation for probably since I was a teenager. And I don't know, you've probably seen it. I'm sure our listeners have seen it, but sometimes you'll find on YouTube compilations, and they'll be, 8 or 5 years old about pre-code naughty moments in animation, or we can't believe this happened back in the day, or something like that, or just even if you've watched something growing up, like Bugs Bunny, and you see drag or gay gags, and you kind of go, huh, that's interesting. What's going on with this? And I began to look online, and I didn't see it really cataloged anywhere. People will mention it, it's acknowledged, but it's not easily searchable or accessible.
Yeah.
So I wanted to create a resource that made that available for people, especially works that are really under-examined or given any attention, like student works or something from another country that is usually overlooked. I feel Europe and Australia, really major areas that could be explored and examined in greater depth than they are
Yeah.
now, especially compared to something like American animation or Japanese animation, like anime and OVAs. Right now, I have for my notes, the top 3 countries are America, Japan, and Canada.
Mhm.
That's the order.
So the earliest that I could find was Breath of a Nation, 1910. Is that correct?
So on my website, that is correct. I'm going to go and check, and I can tell you what the earliest film is that I have, and it is from the 1910s. It's Crazy Cat Goes A-Wooing. So that's the earliest one. That's 1916.
What is your process of finding things?
My process is interesting because I do it there's a lot of different routes that I go.
Yeah.
So there's I would say there's a few main routes. One is for more contemporary films. I see what it's showing at film festivals. So there's a letterbox user called Mundo F, and he has these massive film compilations of queer films, and it's both major feature-length films, films of secondary interest, and then he has a huge list of just shorts. And I will go through individually every single one of those films.
So the older stuff, now that seems like it's a little less straightforward because there's just so much more.
Yes.
Well,
Uh,
that's one thing that's really special about this site is that and your writing in general, because you also
mhm.
do some writing for cartoon
Yes.
research, is that it's so well researched. It's
Thank you.
impeccably researched. And you're also very careful about how you classify things. You had this idea of how you were interested in kind of the canonical rather than the theoretical views. So what is your kind of criteria for deciding on inclusion of a title? Like what makes
So
it work?
So I'm very strict. I think I'm much more strict, I think, than other people are when it comes to cataloging this, because I like to make sure I come more from the not cynical, I come more from the scientific side of analyzing this. And I go, okay, if I was the person who was playing devil's advocate, can I disprove that this is a gay character? And so I have, for instance, hundreds of films that aren't in my official list yet, because I'm still going to go back to them and argue why it is or isn't. And because these are older films, the people who worked on them are dead. So I can't check with them and go, oh, was this a joke here? Was this a joke there? I kind of have to do guesswork. I have to see patterns. And some of these films are let me sit on it, look back at it, and see
Yeah.
how my analysis of this has changed because that isn't ever way how I find these films is through luck. Honestly, it's just watching and watching these.
Right.
And if you read descriptions sometimes, I've done this enough where I can read a description and go, okay, this might fit my research because there's keywords of identity or there's keywords of coming of age or there's keywords of finding oneself. There's these little hints here and there. Films that aren't cataloged as animation sometimes will be called a montage, or they'll mention different types of, in the description, you'll get an idea about if it was animated or not as well.
Yeah. And it's just interesting. With my own experience with this, with live action, I just collect clips as I see them. And because I think it's interesting to look at and ask yourself, how is this character being seen? Because like with the pansy craze or something you describe as the teapotting pose, where there's the hand on the hip kind of showing an effeminate man. How much are they teasing this person and how much is this person maybe just a little bit of a delight and different? And I just feel like in the live ones, it's much more like, yes, they're being mocked, but they also have these great careers and they're kind of fearless and kind of amazing from a modern standpoint. Animation, it seems like it's a little more of a laugh at than laugh with. What is your take on that?
Oh, I definitely think it's more of a laugh at than laugh with because
Yeah.
animation, I feel, almost has to be even broader and more obvious. You see sometimes, it depends on the sort, but sometimes than it is with live action. Say you can't really do a subtle camera close up. You have to draw all of that. Everything is even more intentional. And so everything becomes even more broad in a way. And about the line art, the color of the ink that you're doing, the close-ups, the scene shots, because you have to create everything literally from scratch in a way that is different than with live action. And there are so many moments where I've watched these where the gay characters will just be humiliated. I know I mentioned it in my Tom and Jerry analysis, where the way that they are exited from the scene is that it's through a humiliating moment. And it's not constant. You're not going to watch maybe 10 of these and go, oh, constant, constant, constant insult, constant laugh at. But you will notice it. There's this element of violence that you're not necessarily going to see in live action in the same way because they can't just go and drop kick someone out of the scene
Right. Yeah. It's
versus
true. Yeah.
versus with something like in Tom and Jerry, I think pots and pans, they're having soup and the soup is going to fall on them. The soup goes into a tidal wave. Yes, it is pots and pans. And that's the one with the very effeminate man and then the very gruff man. And they have different voices. And the effeminate one has the gruff voice. And the trade, as I called it, had the very effeminate voice. Salt shaker goes
Yeah.
whoops and then jumps into the soup and the soup flies up. But you don't see the impact, but they're implying an impact. And that's not something that I can think of in any live action where the queer characters are given that type of physicality of their humiliation. There are queer characters that have a type of humiliation done to them, but not in the extreme way that you'd see in animation that they can allow.
Yeah. They might fall. They might be
Yeah,
insulted by another
they might,
character.
yeah, they might be made fun of, but they're not exactly falling through. There's one cartoon. It's a very bizarre one. It's a very long scene of a gay character that is very under-examined in the canonical, but what happens is he falls into a manhole. And I'm pretty convinced it's supposed to be a double entendre with the manhole. I've seen that used before in an adult animation that predates it. So there's a really high chance that they were kind of poking fun at that type of gag in there.
Yeah.
Going to Blazes, that's the sort from 1933, where there's a gay character and he gets attacked with an axe in it. And it's one of the most violent scenes that I've ever seen of queer violence. He literally is attacked because he's gay. That's how the scene's depicted. And
I mean, that's shocking to me because it
yeah,
usually seems like it's light, even though it feels violent in some respects because of the intent. So, what other things have you seen like that maybe you didn't expect in something older?
like that level of violence.
Or just, things that you would not expect to happen in that
There's
era.
from that era, I know there's a Tom and Jerry sequence where there's two men kissing. If you read on one of the comments of my cartoon research, someone mentions it, which I have meant to update. I knew before that person commented. I just do not have the time to update a lot of my writing. Here's one that was surprising is in Any Rags, that's a Fleischer short with Coco the Clown, and he asks about if they're selling a Charles Atlas statue, and Coco goes, "Oh, like in a red tie." He mentions about a red tie, and everyone goes, "Whoops!" And the red tie had a queer significance in New York during that period, which means that someone who worked on the staff knew that.
And
And
whoops, too, is a phrase.
yes,
This seems to come up a lot.
whoops though is mo known a lot more though I feel outside of New York. The red tie was a lot more niche. That was something that unless you were in the community or you were aware of what the community was, would know that. It's a really interesting, very subtle joke that they play up that if you did not understand the significance, you would know that's what it meant. But it was very much a code phrase for that period.
And that's interesting because who in the audience really was clued in if it's kind of the city?
Yeah, it's very much a New York. Fleischer has a lot of queer gags, a lot. There is kind of a joke in one of the employee newsletters that implies one of the employees may or may not have been gay or like to cross-dress, and they made queer gags now and then inside their actual newsletter. They knew something was going on. Unfortunately, I personally don't know yet any confirmed queer employees who worked at Fleischer during that period. So at minimum, they were aware, likely someone who was working there was queer, but I find it always impossible with these staffs of
Yeah.
hundreds that every single person was heterosexual during this period. Whether they were out is a second situation.
Well, that's what's interesting to me is there was somebody there and you wonder what kind of influence they had on these images.
And New York was such a queer space at this point. You had Mae West the drag have huge controversy. You had Harlem balls. You had these major drag balls that were happening. You had Carl Van Vetzen going into Harlem and taking pictures of all these intellectuals and a lot of queer individuals who, unless you were in that circle, you would not know that they were queer. You had the Broadway brevities being published. There's theories that the person who published it may or may not have been queer himself. And in these papers, you have a lot of acknowledgement of queer identities. I've been researching books written about Greenwich Village, written about the club life from the early 30s, and they'll mention female impersonators. There was actually a pansy club that was around during the 30s, supposedly. And there are acknowledgments of gay individuals who were living here in the 1930s, like in published books. So we know that people were very aware in New York that this was going on to some degree, at least into the intellect degree.
And it definitely made it into the movies. I mean,
Yep.
you get a scene in a club like you're mentioning in Collar Savage, I think. Clara
Yep.
Bow. Yeah.
Yep. And that's in the village too.
Yeah. Yeah, like everybody trotted down to the village in their pearls and silk and yeah, went to these clubs. So I do think that you can see then that there's probably the influence of people who did that and it was their entertainment and they brought it in. But yeah, I still think there are definitely queer voices in there having some sort of an influence. Moving forward from pre-code, how has queer animation evolved over the years?
So pretty much when the code stepped in, that really put a halt to what was happening. And I can give you what my current stats are of pre-code and then move onward. And I'll just do the 30 year and then so 1930, as of right now, I have 14 films. 1931 is 23 films. 1932 is 27 films. 1933 is 32 films. 1934, 12. It severely got limited down. And I do want to note that this is not final. These numbers will still keep growing. But I
Yeah.
think it's a very good estimate of what was happening. And I think when I did my math, I didn't find another year that breached 50 films until the 1950s for one year.
Wow.
And then even then after that, it didn't take until the 90s that you really start to have an uptick because the 60s was a period where the studios were shutting down and independent was starting to increase. The 70s was also a period of independent. So you couldn't have a lot of these mass outputs the way that you necessarily were doing in the 50s or the 40s. And then the 80s was the AIDS epidemic. So a lot of creators were just trying to survive. I don't have actually a lot of my data from the 80s is a lot of international. It's not just necessarily American. A lot of works are coming out of Japan during this period, and they're not particularly flattering. Dragon Ball Z released a film in the 80s with a gay Nazi pedophile. So
Yeah.
you also have the rise of Yaoi and Yuri happening a little bit before that, but the 80s is really starting this uptick, and that type of film, the boys love and the girls love is more so
Hmm.
90s, but boys love and girls love is very controversial because a lot of it is how the depictions are being done. These are age gap relationships that are portrayed a lot. Then the 90s sweeps in, and that's also pretty much around the start of the new queer cinema movement. And you have a major uptick of queer films coming out during this period. Right now, the number that I have for queer films from the 90s, and keep in mind, this is my international, so this includes everything, is 237.
It really
And,
changed.
and to compare that, the 80s was 82. So it's a massive uptick. And you also have a lot more TV. You have things like The Simpsons, Homer's Phobia is coming out. You have South Park, which had the episode Big Gay Al's Boat Ride, which is actually getting censored now. Big Gay Al's Boat Ride is apparently getting, I know there was some
Uh,
controversy about that episode getting censored. Like ending out the millennium, you have a major feature-length film with a gay character, which is Big Gay Al, and it's the South Park film.
yeah, a huge part of that film too,
Yeah.
if I remember right.
He performs a number at the end. That's his big
Yeah.
performance. And interestingly enough, fun fact is that I do know that someone gay did animate on that sequence. I don't know if he requested it, if he was given it because he was gay, or if it was just a coincidence that he happened to be gay and he ended up animating on the gay musical sequence. I've wanted to ask him if that was just coincidental that he ended up animating the big musical number.
That is a good question because that would change a lot depending on what the answer is, like how you would look at it. I do think it's interesting just looking at your site, how much more explicit in its messaging the newer films are, like the past few years, but also just that you start with this monolith basically in the 1910s, one certain way that the queer life is portrayed. And the thing that strikes me about the newer ones is not that just that it's more explicitly stated, but it's like it shows how diverse it is, how many tiny little differences there are. It's so humanizing.
Yeah, and that was very purposeful in my part. I really wanted to make sure to include queer representation when possible that had to do with intersectionality. So, queer representation of people who are BIPOC, queer representation of people with disabilities, queer representation of women, or by women directors, or by directors who are BIPOC as well, because a lot of that is overlooked in this narrative. That's also the narrative that, fortunately, is very present as well. So it's not easy to like, I don't believe I find a lot of, I think the first female directors I have are the 70s. And the first director who are BIPOC that aren't from Japan or that like are based in America are around the 90s. It's really hard to get a diverse voice when the diverse voices aren't, unfortunately, at the table
Hmm.
and they're getting overlooked because something like you can't necessarily compete with something like The Simpsons or something like South Park
Yeah.
when you're a small indie creator who is making their film when they're in college or making their film completely out of pocket. I will say that the 90s is a very interesting period also because you have people uploading their works onto the internet, and that's how they're being discovered, which was a very new thing, which is a very fascinating aspect of the 90s that you wouldn't have existed in the 50s.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you sent me a link from an interview with animator named Veronica Soul, and
Yes.
with you talking about these people who are underrepresented behind the camera, in addition in front of it. I find it interesting that she was a pioneer and didn't even really seem to know it herself. I mean, can you tell me a little bit about her?
So Veronica Soul is a very, I find Veronica Soul absolutely fascinating. And I feel that she is very overlooked in this history. And I mean, even the fact that her film is Canadian, but if you look everywhere, it's credited as purely US, shows just how little is really discussed about this film. And I know it was screened at a festival in the 2000s for whatever reason. I would love that film to have more accessibility.
Now, what was the name of the film?
How the hell are you?
How the hell are you?
And it's the first film that, at least in Canada, that was directed by a woman with gay animated representation.
And 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 you do know that pretty much for a
As of
fact.
right now, that is a fact for Canada. The earliest film that was directed by a woman with queer representation is Prince Ahmed from Germany.
Right. Because
Yeah,
there's a connection. Yeah.
which I found hilarious. I first thought it was so funny. It's a very small, you realize how small this world is of
Yeah.
animators.
So Seoul knew Lottie Reiniger.
Yes, very, very briefly. They were teaching, they were at the same time in Canada during that period.
And seemed to be thrilled to know this young filmmaker and teach her kind of the tricks of the trade, like how to smoothly cut animation and all of that. Yeah, I mean, there's so many just in the interviews you've done with people and the research you've done, there's just so much information that you've taken in and processed and digested for all of us. What overall, looking at this whole history, intrigues you the most?
What always intrigues me are the films that we don't talk about. I'm really a big fan of stop motion, and I really like world animation. And stop motion is examined and it's brought to attention, but international animation is very much overlooked in the queer animation history books. And by that, and as I had mentioned earlier, I'm not talking about Japan and I'm not talking about Canada, I'm talking about Australia. A lot of the early films in Australia are directed by women that have queer representation. Those films date as early as the 80s. And that's a history that I wish was acknowledged more. On my main list, I have 68 countries
Wow.
confirmed.
You're going to be busy for
Yeah.
a long time, aren't you?
Yeah. And people keep making films. I mean, I personally like to look at things that predate the 21st century for sanity reasons,
Yeah.
but I find the world animation aspect very, very fascinating. And it's something that I want to make more available to people so that this history can be traced better.
What do
Yes.
you really like about, I mean, what are some titles that kind of stand out to you as something people need to check out?
So for American, and I always tell people this film because it's one of my favorite films on my website, and it's Pedro and Tony. It's a wonderful stop motion film. It's about someone who's American who is dating someone who is an immigrant from the Philippines and about their different cultural identities and how they clash. And this is also represented by the fact that the American is portrayed as a dog and I believe Pedro is portrayed as a rooster. And so there's also that kind of clash just as different types of animal species as well, but it's done very, very well. And the director, all of his films, I've cried over his films. They're so beautiful. And he sadly passed away in the early 2000s. There's something that he left too early. That's how I feel.
Yeah,
And
there's promise.
interestingly, his partner worked on Shrek, which is a very,
Oh, wow.
yeah, wild little fact because I ended up looking up his partner just to see what he had done. And I was like, oh, we worked on Shrek. What an interesting connection right there.
This is a
And
small world animation, it seems
yeah,
like, which I mean, it makes sense. It's very specialized.
for international,
Yeah.
a film, and I'm just going to go also what's on my website because I want people to be able to, if they visit my website, be able to actually watch these films. I don't want to say something that's like, oh, this is a very obscure film. It's
Yeah.
just, no, that's
Travel to an archive wide and far.
exactly. It's not. I really like the films that come from Spain. So I recommend something like Unanimated from 2011 that is a very interesting little sort. It's a bit ambiguous. He doesn't explicitly state that he's gay, but it's very much implied that he's gay and he's a cartoon and he is trying to find his connection with other tunes and he's talking to his therapist about this. And it's very quirky and it's a really interesting interpretation of the animated medium combined with live action that you don't necessarily see. And then in terms of older films, I would recommend something done by Barry J.C. Purvis, who did Achilles. Now, for those who do check out Achilles, this is a NSF. This is not suitable for work, so do not watch. Just be warned, it is another stop motion film. I'm very biased towards stop motion, and the way that he animates with stop motion is beautiful. And he is very good at being able to capture away from an uncanny valley that many people can struggle with in stop motion. But his work is gorgeous, all of his work. And he has several films that are available to view that aren't just Achilles. If someone doesn't want to go full NSFW at the workplace. And that film was from 1995.
So I thought it was kind of funny that you have two Godzilla films.
Yes,
There's
Godzilla.
Godzilla versus Lando, and then a
Yeah,
more recent one coming out,
yeah,
Godzilla Icon.
that's a great. And as mentioned in that Godzilla, the Twitter or X actually reposted that. They shared that. So it's unofficially canon in a way.
I think it's just so interesting that it was chosen like decades apart and kind of just different reasons. Like
Yes,
Godzilla's witnessing everybody's queerness.
and it's so interesting that I've always wanted to do a program called Don't Play with Your Toys, which is an examination of using queerness through toys and nostalgia. Because I have seen queer stop motion with Legos. Legos are obviously the major one. Fisher Price, I've seen, and Playmobil toys are another one. So I've been like, I found the trifecta. Barbie dolls. Barbie
Yes.
dolls are a lot. Barbie dolls has a queer history dating at least to the 90s and may even date to the 80s of being utilized in a queer context, which is fascinating to me.
So you're writing a book too.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
So originally I was going to do one book from 1916 to 1999, and I didn't feel I could do the post Stonewall period justice the way that I want to, because one of my goals is to properly give attention to many of the animators and the artists who passed away during the AIDS epidemic. And I feel it's very important to have their memories be preserved in some way and try to get as much information that I can about them in a way that it's not just a paragraph on a page. And I can devote maybe at least 1 or 2 pages to their contributions and their input in this history. And so I decided to split it into 2 parts, which is 1916 to 1969, and then probably 1970 to 1999. And that 29-year period, as I had mentioned, there's over 200 films from the
Yeah.
90s. So, and granted, that's everything, but there's a solid 100 films alone from America from that period. And I have not even really started my scratch into the 70s to the 90s of what I'm missing. So I'm sure I'll find much, much more. So I really want to give that attention too, because the 90s was also a period with actual queer directors making these works versus maybe some of the people who did these films in the pre-Stonewall period. I do know there were some that were gay, but majority are by heterosexual men. So being able to properly give the attention also to people who were making these films is very important to me.
I like that this is what you're doing with your work overall. You're being so careful and deliberate. And what it comes down to is you're being respectful of people in their work, by showing it in the way that it was meant to be seen
And it's
accurately and, lovingly.
and I always grapple with myself with some of these cold emails that I write to people because some of my questions are, this person, are they gay because of X, Y, and Z? And obviously, whenever I ask this, I only focus on people who are dead. I only focus on people where I'm seeing hints of something of their life.
Yeah.
But it's a very nerve-wracking email to send because these were people who may not have wanted to be outed later in life. It's also very hard to know because many of these people worked during a period where they couldn't come out. So we don't or didn't feel comfortable or safe being openly out in the work environment that they were in. So it's a bit difficult to know, am I being respectful? Am I being disrespectful by talking
Yeah.
about their sexuality? Was that something that they would consent to? Some of them might not be, and I have to respect that. It, like I said, depends on the context. I feel that when people talk a lot about gay actors, it's very salacious and it's very gossipy. And it's not necessarily how these people would want their lives remembered.
I really appreciate your diligence in this and how you're being so fair by going as directly as you can to the source and just how you're putting it all together.
I don't want my writing to turn into this gossip piece of this book of just salacious sexploitation, kind of like a Kenneth Anger's Babylonian type
Hmm.
book.
When it's all just people wanting to do their work and live their lives and nothing
Yeah,
sensational about it.
and a lot of this type of work, honestly, yeah, I don't want my book to turn into Hollywood Babylon.
Yeah.
That's not what I want this to be. And then, Karina Longworth goes and debunks it for, a
The
multi-part
episode.
podcast. But I think and especially with gay identities and gay history, it is very much fueled with rumors. It is very much fueled with gossip, the whisperings behind closed doors, or I guess you would say more adequately behind closed closets in a
It's
way.
really
So,
hard to get beyond that. It's true.
yeah.
Well, Esther, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been fascinating. I have so many things I want to see now. And it's been so much fun going through queer animation and learning some new titles that I'd never heard of. So thank you for your work. Looking forward to seeing that book someday. Maybe you can come on and talk to me about it. And thank you for taking the time.
Oh, definitely.
Thank
So,
you.
To learn more about Esther's queer animation project and how to support them, go to watchingclassicmovies.com. If you're enjoying the show, please rate and review wherever you listen. I appreciate your support. Thank you for listening. This is Kendall Kruver, watching classic movies. Until next time.